Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. I want to send a very special thank you out to our latest patron on patreon.com/History of the Papacy, Demetrios at the Antioch level. Thank you so much, Demetrios, for choosing to support the History of the Papacy. I have a separate note today. Before we get started, I have to express my deepest apologies to several patrons of the show on patreon.com/History of the Papacy. I somehow got the audio tracks of the diptychs switched up and mixed all around, and patrons were left out in a number of the previous episodes from the diptychs. I want to send out a really special thank you to patron Augustus for pointing this out to me. I'm not sure how it happened, but I have fixed it now and know that I am very deeply sorry for this mix-up, and I always appreciate your support. I want you to know that. I want to thank everybody on Patreon because you go such a long way in supporting the show and keeping this going. So enjoy today's show, and thank you again. We are rapidly coming to the close of this season of the History of the Papacy on the papacy of Pius IX in the 19th century. So much happened during this roughly 100 years we've discussed in this episode. In this series, the 2 central themes of this series have been that the papacy of Pius IX marked the end of the Middle Ages of the papacy. This is an over 1,000-year time where the popes of Rome held both religious and secular power. Both the religious and secular power waxed and waned over the course of the time between the 750s to the 1860s AD. By the 1860s, the secular power of the popes was basically gone. But the religious power of the popes was near supreme. A particular document called the Syllabus of Errors was something like a declaration of independence of the papacy. Quanta Cura and the Syllabus of Errors were the pebbles kicked down the mountain that started the avalanche of the First Vatican Council. These 2 monumental documents marked the point where the new papacy was established. Here is the tale of the Syllabus of Errors. Let's start with a little background. Syllabus is a Latin word for collection. In this case, a collection of errors or problems the Catholic Church had with what was going on in the middle of the 19th century world. It was published in December 4th of 1864, 2 days before the papal encyclical Quanta Cura was promulgated. The Syllabus of Errors was seen as an introduction to Quanta Cura and was added as an addendum to that papal encyclical. The Syllabus of Errors could be considered a primer of sorts for the more detailed Quanta Cura, and was a full torpedo broadside by the papacy against the errors of modernism, meaning classical liberalism and the ideas of the Enlightenment. All of these topics were covered in great detail and depth in many episodes of this series, so I highly encourage you to go back and listen. Absolutely no punches were pulled on either the Syllabus of Errors or Quanta Cura. The policies and ideas of Pius IX and the Ultramontane Church were clearly staked in these two documents. So why write a list of problems the church had with society? The direct history of the syllabus went back to 1849. We could take it back to the 1700s and earlier, and we have, but let's stay as close to the actual time of the late 1860s and early 1870s as we can. There was a local synod in the city of Spoleto, Italy, that wanted a list of errors for teaching purposes. That's kind of weird, don't you think? It's interesting to wonder why the synod at this particular time wanted a list of things to teach against. One way or the other, Pius IX was intrigued with this idea. So in 1852, Pius had a cardinal named Raffaele Fornari, who was prefect for the Congregation of Catholic Education, to basically draft up a set of specific errors of modern society. Fornari worked on it for some time, but was transferred to work on the committee that was writing the bull on the Immaculate Conception. That was a really important job for him, and really, in a way, I guess you could say a major promotion for his career. A bishop from southern France picked up on the job, and he listed a document with 85 errors. Another group working on the issue developed a list of 61 errors in 1862. This set of errors stirred up a ton of controversy, and so they dialed it back a little bit. And then yet another group was put together, and this group came up with the 80 thesis document that we know of today. This is the first list published as the Syllabus of Errors in 1864. The syllabus was sent off as an official communication from the Secretary of State of the Church to all the bishops of the Catholic world. It was not sent out as a papal bull or encyclical. It wasn't even signed off by Pius IX himself. At this point, at least, not until Quanta Cura comes along, and then it's added as an official part of that encyclical. The reaction to the Syllabus of Error was a complete barn burner. It was blasted all over the world, especially in places that prided themselves on many of the ideas condemned in the syllabus, like the US, Britain, and France, and even more countries. We'll talk about the blowout in a bit, though. Let's look at what the document actually says first. And at that, let's look at the organization of the text, even before we get into the content. The syllabus is broken into 10 major categories of errors, 80 individual points or theses. There is the errors of pantheism, naturalism, and absolute rationalism. The second is moderate rationalism. The third is indifferentism and latitudinarianism. The fourth is socialism, communism, secret societies, biblical societies, clerico-liberal societies. The fifth category includes errors concerning the church and her rights. Category 6, errors about civil society considered both in itself and its relation to the church. Category 7, errors concerning natural and Christian ethics. Category 8, errors concerning Christian marriage, errors regarding the civil power of the sovereign pontiff, and then last but not least, errors having reference to modern liberalism. These points were all statements of errors or areas where the church was in disagreement with modern society. The Catholic Church, in short, was not in favor of any of these points in any way possible. The document is fairly long and would be much, much longer if it didn't abbreviate the arguments in the background of each point. It's filled with references to other bulls, encyclicals, texts, biblical tracts, councils, and all sorts of other documents. So if you wanted to have that in all one thing, it would probably be volumes that would fill up half your bookshelf. As it is, it's still a pretty long document. Now, I'm going to share some points from the Syllabus of Errors, and again, I can't read all of it to you, but I think you'll start to get the drift, and you can definitely find the syllabus very easily for free on the internet, both in text and in audio, and I will link to the version I used from papalencyclicals.net. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. So regarding the first point, pantheism, naturalism, and absolute rationalism. The first point, there exists no supreme, all-wise, all-provident, divine being distinct from the universe, and God is identical with nature of things, and is therefore subject to changes. In effect, God is produced in man and in the world, and all things are God and have the very substance of God, and God is one and the same thing in the world, and therefore spirit with matter, necessity and with liberty, good with evil, justice with injustice. And then there's a quote to another document. Here's another one, point 3. Human reason without any reference whatsoever to God is the sole arbiter of truth and falsehood and of good and evil. It is law to itself and suffices by its natural force to secure the welfare of men and of nations. I think you can see from both of those points that the church is really laying down that there is a God. They're reinforcing the traditional Christian dogmas, and they're taking a really big shot at rationalism and humanism, that really man can be God in and of himself. But let's look at point 6 from that category. The faith of Christ is in opposition to human reason and divine revelation. Not only is it not useful, but is even hurtful to the perfection of man. I think that first part of the clause would be absolute straight boilerplate Christianity at that point. The second point, I think they're trying to make a bigger point that of the humanisms, again, humanism, that man can find perfection without Christianity, and that would obviously be a very big no-no. And then I have to quote this, number 7. The prophecies and miracles set forth and recorded in the sacred scriptures are the fiction of poets, and the mysteries of the Christian faith the result of philosophical investigations. In the books of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are contained mythical inventions, and Jesus Christ himself is a myth. That's a big shot at the German biblical exegesis tradition that's coming up there, that the Bible is basically a collection of myths, and that there's probably no historical Jesus. This is getting into the first quest for the historical Jesus. So it's kind of with Pius IX here and with the Syllabus of Errors, it's the first pushback against all of this academic look at the Bible that we will see bloom into people like Bart Ehrman and all of mostly Germans at this time. It's the first pushback officially by the church against this burgeoning academicism of the Bible and of the Christ myth theory and that sort of thing. Now, category 2, moderate rationalism. And moderate rationalism is a technical definition in philosophy, in that rationalism has precedence over other ways of acquiring knowledge. And let's look at number 9. All dogmas of the Christian religion are indiscriminately the object of natural science or philosophy and human reason, enlightened solely in an historical way, is able by its own natural strength and principles to attain to the true science of even the most abstruse dogmas, provided only that such dogmas be proposed to reason itself as its objects. Again, a big discussion of reason and rationalism. Basically what a lot of the scholars of the day are saying, and the atheists and the liberals are saying, is that Christianity and religion's completely irrational, and that through human mind they can figure out what's happening in science and in the world, where the Church of Pius IX is clearly saying no. Then point 13, the methods and principles by which the old scholastic doctors cultivated theology are no longer suitable to the demands of our time and to the progress of science. So it's basically saying this tradition, which, I mean, no matter where you fall on religion, it was basically medieval theologians and early modern theologians that gave the scientific method. They don't have any place anymore. It's only rational secular scientists, is what a lot of people were saying in the 19th century and to this day, but that's a different point for a different podcast episode. What the church is saying, no, we invented this thing, and we have a say in how it goes. Let's move on to category 3, indifferentism, latitudinarianism, which is a belief that religion doesn't matter and the tolerance of other ideas and religions should be made central to a society. And we'll look at points 15 and 16, and I'll just read them. They're 2 separate points, but they're closely related. Every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which, guided by the light of reason, he shall consider true. And then point 16, man may, in the observance of any religion whatever, find the way of eternal salvation and arrive at eternal salvation. That gets into a lot of things that were bubbling up at this time called ecumenism, where Catholics would talk to Orthodox and Protestants, even what's inside of Christianity. And then they talk to Jews and Muslims and Hindus and any other religion and say, hey, we can all get together. We're multiple paths to climb the mountain, and we'll all get there together. At least in the 1800s, Pius IX was not down with that. And a lot of the conservatives would not be down with the ecumenism at all. Let's go to point 4, socialism, communism, secret societies, biblical societies, clerico-liberal societies. I love it how they lump together basically most of the problematic groups that the Catholic Church was fighting against at that time. And for all of that, there's only one point that gets thrown into this. And the syllabus basically says, we've talked about all of this plenty, so you get the drift. Here it goes. Pests of this kind are frequently reprobated in the severest terms in the encyclical Quibus Quantesque and a few others. And that one is not written in the negative. That's just saying we've dealt with this and you get what we're coming from. Then we have error 5, category 5, errors concerning the church and her rights. There's a lot of history wrapped up into this one. The conflict between the secular state, the church, the conflict between the church as a secular or temporal, the conflict between the church as a secular or temporal power, i.e. the papal states, are all in here. So let's read a couple of the points. I've selected a lot of them, but I have to edit myself down, even though this one is great. The church is not a true and perfect society, entirely free, nor is she endowed with proper and perpetual rights of her own, conferred upon her by her divine founder. But it appertains to the civil power to define what are the rights of the church and the limits within which she may exercise those rights. So point 20, the ecclesiastical power ought not to exercise its authority without the permission and the assent of the civil government. Point 24, the church has not the power of using force, nor has she any temporal power, direct or indirect. There it is, all there just laid out for you on a silver platter. The church is saying, heck yeah, we have a right to butt our noses into the secular societies of France, of Germany, of Italy, United States even, you name it, and that they really don't have any authority to butt their noses into what the church is saying. Also, the point of that the Catholic Church doesn't have any temporal power whatsoever, which at this point, in the 1860s, they essentially don't, because the papacy is only a temporal power in more or less Vatican City at this point in the 1860s. But again, they're laying out in the syllabus a very clear idea that we can mess in your politics, you can't mess with our politics, and yes, we are a actual state. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Another one, the point 26, the church has no innate and legitimate right of acquiring and possessing property. Then 34, the teaching of those who compare the sovereign pontiff to a prince, free and acting in the universal church, is a doctrine which prevailed in the Middle Ages. And then 37, national churches withdrawn from the authority of the Roman pontiff and altogether separated can be established. And then 38, we'll wrap up with, the Roman pontiffs have, by their too arbitrary conduct, contributed to the division of the church into Eastern and Western. This is shots all over the board here, but it's really pointing to the ultramontane church. The Church of Rome is supreme. The Roman pontiff is supreme. There's national churches that they have a national synod, but they're not a thing in their own right. Like if we were to compare it to the Protestant churches, for example, that you have a national church in England, and then you have the denomination of the Presbyterians, you have the Anglicans. Compare it to Germany had a national church. France, not so much at this time, but each one of those places had Protestants had national churches as well as denominations. The Pope had no truck with that, obviously. He also had no tolerance for the Gallicans, who had their own French thing going. It also has no time for the way the Orthodox were doing it, that within basically the nation or an ethnos, there was a supreme church, the Russian church, the Bulgarian church, the Greek church, the this church, the that church, that had their own head. They're basically their own independent body, just only in communion with each other. No. That will not exist in an ultramontane church. Last and not least for this category, the Pope is also saying that, hey, there are divisions all over the place, but it's not the Pope's fault for doing this, no matter what people say and want to blame that the Pope caused all these fractures. There shouldn't be fractures, and there's sure not the Pope's fault if there are fractures. Let's move on to category 6, errors about civil society considered both in itself and in its relation to the church. Again, I had a hard time editing out all the different points. And believe me, with each one of these categories, I edited them down as much as I could, or at least that I felt that I wanted to. And I'm trying to edit them down even further to just get us the gist. But this one, 40, the teachings of the Catholic Church is hostile to the well-being and interests of society. That one stands on its own. Now, this one, in the case of conflicting laws enacted by the two powers, the civil law prevails. What they're saying is that if the church is against something and the church has a canon or a law against it, it doesn't matter that France has a law against this or Spain has a law on the opposite side. Church law trumps civil law. Number 44, we have seen many times in the series why this would be considered an error. The civil authority may interfere in matters relating to religion, morality, and spiritual government. Hence, it can pass judgment on the instructions issued for the guidance of consciences, conformably with their mission by the pastors of the church. Further, it has the right to make enactments regarding to the administration of the divine sacraments and the dispositions necessary for receiving them. Point 48, Catholics may approve of the system of educating youth unconnected with Catholic faith and the power of the church, in which regards the knowledge of merely natural things and only, or at least primarily, the ends of earthly social life. That one's a big one, especially in places that were, as we're seeing in the 1800s, first state-provided education. Places like Germany had that very early. The United States had that very early. And then the move towards compulsory education, which was really in a lot of places, that's kind of the darker side of compulsory education in a lot of places, was that the people who founded the public schools or the state-sponsored schools were pushing Protestant ideas and were trying to, in effect, Protestantize the children of Catholics. And what the Pope is saying is that that's wrong. We're against that. And that the children should really be going to some sort of Catholic school and not these public schools that are masked as secular, but are actually pushing a Protestant message. Then this last one, we just have to mention 55. The church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the church. Boom. Like that is big time, goes against everything in, say, a place like the United States that really, well, not that people debate the First Amendment about the separation of church and state. And if you break out your constitution, it doesn't technically say anything about the separation of church and state, but it really became the ethos of the United States that the state should really have no say in the church, and really that the church should not have a direct say in what was going on in the secular government or the civil government. And we all know that that all gets interwound together, but there should at least be some idea that the church and the state are completely separate entities, that because once they become too enmeshed together, then you get something very different. And that's a completely anathema to the Pius IX idea of Christianity. We're a little more than halfway through the points of the syllabus of errors, but let's leave it there for today. Next time, we will finish talking about the categories and individual points of the syllabus of errors, then take a look at the reaction to the syllabus around the Catholic Church and the world beyond.